Good afternoon, everyone. Librarian Danielle Belanger here from the Cote-Saint-Luc Public Library, joining you virtually. Today, we have another great program for you. The library is thrilled to have the opportunity to host a second conversation with best-selling author Julia Kelly. Thank you very much, Julia, for taking the time to speak with me today, all the way from London, and to Mackenzie and Kaylee at Simon & Schuster for making this event possible. Thanks also to Andreas at Paragraph Bookstore for collaborating with us on this wonderful event. So to begin with, I will share a condensed bio. Julia Kelly is the award-winning author of books about ordinary women and their extraordinary stories. In addition to writing, she's been an Emmy-nominated producer, journalist, marketing professional, and for one summer, a tea waitress. Julia called Los Angeles, Iowa, and New York City home before settling in London. Readers can visit juliakellywrites.com, WRITES, of course, to learn more about all of her books and sign up for her newsletter so they never miss a new release. Welcome back, Julia.
Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be back.
It's wonderful to have you back, and congratulations on another beautifully written novel.
Thank you.
Before we even discuss your latest novel, The Last Dance of the Debutante, which I have right here, beautiful book, let's briefly speak about your bio. For those who missed it last time, what was it like working as a tea waitress?
Oh, it was one of those jobs that you take between, in my case, high school, because I'm from the United States originally, and going off to university. And it was one of those things where I really enjoyed the paycheck at the end of the week. It was challenging. It was tough. It was, a classic waitressing job. You're on your feet all the time. And in this case, you were also working, had a little shop, and you're turning around tables and making sure that, the food's going out, but also doing all the selling. So it was exhausting. And I was very, very glad to be done with the summer. But I certainly at 18 wasn't unhappy about having a bit of extra cash going to university. So
very nice. And is there anything that you drew upon from those experiences for this book?
Not so much for this book, except I do love a cup of tea. So I suppose one of the wonderful things about growing up with an expat, British expat mother and a father who loves tea very much, and then also having this job is it is kind of a constant presence in my life. There's a kettle going almost all the time. I drink tea pretty constantly. So it's a hard habit to shake, and I'm not sure I'd want to break that habit.
Thank you. Emmy-nominated producer. That sounds quite exciting. Can you please tell us a bit more about this one?
Sure. So I was a journalist. I'm no longer in the business, but I was a journalist, and I was working as a television news producer. And one of the things that I really, really enjoyed as part of that was also working on a documentary series. I actually produced short sports documentaries, and we were very fortunate. It was a show, and the show was nominated. And so there are regional Emmys in the United States. So this was for the New York State area. And it was really a lot of fun. I'm very, very proud of the work that I did there. And I think some of the research and interviewing and things like that actually did come into play with, believe it or not, writing The Last Dance of the Debutante, because some of those journalism skills are very handy when you're doing your research.
Thank you. I've noticed that many of the interviews that we've authored had a career in journalism prior, which seemed to serve them well. So congratulations on another masterfully written novel, allowing readers a glimpse of the twilight days of Britain's grand coming out balls. I'm referring, of course, to The Last Dance of the Debutante, which I was holding right there. Big thank you once again to Simon & Schuster. So I think what we'll do is I will share a synopsis for those listening in today, because I don't believe we have it just yet at the library. It's coming, but it's on its way. So I'm sure people are already putting their name down for it, but I don't think anyone else has read your book just yet at our library.
Okay, wonderful.
When it's announced that 1958 will be the last year debutantes are to be presented at court, thousands of eager mothers and hopeful daughters flood the palace with letters seeking the year's most coveted invitation, a chance for their daughters to curtsy to the young Queen Elizabeth and officially come out into society. In an effort to appease her traditional mother, aspiring university student Lily Nichols agrees to become a debutante and do the season a glittering and grueling string of countless balls and cocktail parties. In doing so, she befriends two very different women, the cool and aloof Leana Hartford, whose apparent perfection hides a darker side, and the ambitious Katherine Norman, who dreams of a career once she helps her parents find their place among the elite. But the glorious effervescence of the season evaporates once Lily learns a devastating secret that threatens to destroy her entire family. Faced with a dark past, she's forced to ask herself what really matters, her family legacy or her own happiness. Sorry, that was a mouthful. Julia, could you please discuss the idea of how the idea for this book first came to you?
Well, I am very fortunate. I come from a family of readers who are always reading, recommending things. And in this case, my mother was up in London for a tea that my friends and I were doing with our mother. So three of us and three mums were all coming to London and having tea. This was just before the pandemic broke out. So we sort of didn't know what was coming. We definitely didn't know what was coming in February of 2020. And so we had gone to Hatch Arts, which is one of my favorite bookstores in London. And after doing a bit of book buying, we went and had a cup of coffee, ironically, before we were going to have some tea. And my mom and I were sitting down and she said, you know, I just read this book and I think it might make a really great novel. And the book is The Last Curtsey by Fiona McCarthy. It has a couple of different names depending on what territory you're in and who is releasing the book. But it's a wonderful history of the last season that debutantes were presented in 1958. And Fiona McCarthy herself was one of those last debutantes. And she not only did the presentation before the Queen, which is really what kicks off the season, but then she also did all of the balls and the parties and the various events that came along with it. And that's really what makes up the bulk of the season. And so she has, you know, wonderful insight into what it was like to be a debutante, but she also has enough of a remove that she kind of understands what was going on in terms of society going through a lot of changes, especially in late 50s Britain. So you have the very, very early rumblings of the swinging 60s and a lot of political change. And then, of course, if we go further along into the 60s, there's, of course, the women's movement and various other movements as well. So you have this old tradition of bringing girls out and presenting them into society, and it's the last of those presentations. And I just thought this is a fantastic time to kind of look at what it would have been like to be one of those women and be pulled in a couple of different directions by different forces in your life.
Historical details, just like in The Last Garden of England, are key to this novel. So you did speak a little bit about how you went about conducting your research. Did you get to interview any of the debutantes from that era, from the late 1950s?
I did actually, and it was really wonderful. I interviewed a woman who had been presented to the Queen, and so she could give me a lot of detail about the actual presentation day, down to the fact that there's a white dot on the carpet that you would stop at, and that would be where you would curtsy, and she would kind of give you a sense of what it felt like. But she actually didn't end up doing the full season. She just did the presentation. So I was lucky enough to also speak to two women who were friends from 1964, when even though the debutante presentations had stopped by that point, there ended up being a continuation of the season, although it was starting to die out really by the mid to late 60s. Various events were no longer happening, and these big coming out balls really went away. But these women both had that full experience, including having a coming out ball and coming out drinks and all that. And it was really fascinating to talk to them, because one of the things that I noticed was I don't think many people have asked them about this period in their lives and what they did for a very, very long time. One woman in particular, she got her phone number from somebody, and I picked up the phone and called her and said, I'm Julia Kelly. I'm the author who's interested in debutantes and is writing this book. And she said, oh, well, I really don't know if I'm going to have anything to tell you. And then proceeded to talk nonstop for 30 minutes. And I was just sitting there, jotting notes down, because she had all these wonderful insights into sort of where she shopped and what it was like. And, everything from sort of what it was like being a young woman going to all these different parties and events. And then suddenly at the end of it, you're no longer a debutante and the season stops and you have to sort of make your way in the world and figure out what your life is going to be like, all the way through to where she got her hair done. So it was really wonderful in adding sort of more detail, more context for not only the experience of being a debutante, but also sort of what it was like if you were not, because different people had different experiences. If you were a girl who liked being out in the world and was a bit more extroverted and easily made friends, I think you probably had a fabulous time. If you were more introverted, it was a lot of parties and a lot of socializing in a way that I think must have been very, very difficult. And I think there are different debutantes in this book who maybe take different approaches to their season and enjoy it to different levels also. So I hope I represented that within the book.
Yes, definitely. So you alluded a little bit to the season. You describe it a lot in the book, how there are teas, there are luncheons, there are balls. The season is not only in England, it continues, I believe, into Scotland.
Yes, it's mobile.
Yes. Did you speak to anyone who went through that whole season, the teas, and then the continuing after sort of even the summer season?
So not quite the entire thing, different, because it was quite expensive to launch a debutante, even at that time. And if you watch something like Bridgerton or, any period drama, often they're talking about the expense of bringing a girl out and, bringing her out in London. And that absolutely was still the case in 1958. So you have a lot of families trying to decide how much of a commitment is this going to be. And so to do the whole thing cost hundreds of pounds, even if you were doing it on an absolute shoestring budget. And it was a lot, and this is hundreds of pounds in 1958, I should say. So you have to adjust a little bit for modern money. And so it really was one of those circumstances where I think families fit whatever the goal was to their resources and also to the girl who was doing the season as well. So you have different experiences for certainly for different debutantes. And like I said, one of the women I spoke to who actually was presented in 1958 didn't do the season, didn't have a coming out party, sort of all the traditional trappings. It really was just being a debutante and being presented. That was the important thing to her family.
The descriptions of the fashion in this book are exquisite. Congratulations on that. Were some of the gowns you described also based on research from this time period or descriptions from some of the ladies you interviewed?
Yeah, I really wish that I had better luck with timing on this book in some ways, because one of the women actually still had her presentation dress, and I saw photographs of it, but I couldn't actually go and see the dress in person because of lockdowns. And also, I'm very fortunate. I live in London, and I had hoped that I would be able to work a little bit with some of the local museums, including the V&A, which has a wonderful collection that it publishes a lot of images online. But to go and actually see the dresses and sort of understand how they moved and what they sounded like and things like that would have been fun. It would have mostly been fun for me. I'm not sure how helpful it would have been in the actual, on the page text. But that's part of the fun of research anyway. So I did a lot of relying on fashion magazines, a lot of relying on preserved clothes in museums and those online collections. And then I looked a lot at two major society magazines at the time, the Tatler and the Sketch, and both of them have your updates about. And I wish I could grab them right now, but unfortunately there's a Christmas tree in front of both of my copies.
Okay.
I have in the flat, or all three of my copies. So, but if I pulled them out and showed them to you, you would see that not only do they have reports of different balls and different events and different sort of society pieces, a lot of concentration and focus is on fashion. So just as you would expect to open open a fashion magazine today and have something about, summer, summer to fall knits, transitional knits, you would have a lot of that too. And a lot of advertisements related to the different places that you could go and buy clothes. So, if you were a very high-end debutante with a very big budget, you might go to Hartnell or Dior or Worth and have your gowns made. You typically have a few long gowns, and then you'd have a white one for something called Queen Charlotte's Ball. You'd have your coming out ball dress or your coming out party dress, and that would be quite special. And then you would have some things that you would have in rotation. So you would be wearing them over and over again, because these girls were going to, they could go to anything from, 6, 10, 12 parties in a week. That wouldn't be unusual. You were party hopping night to night. So you needed cocktail dresses and various other things. So it gave me a little bit more of a sense of where one might have bought some of those things if you weren't going super high end, recognizable even to people today's fashion house names. You would go to department stores and specialty shops, or just have things made up by a dressmaker.
One of the things that I found very interesting about Lily was that she was making some of her own clothes for certain of these events.
Yes.
And this was in part budgetary constraints, of course, that you would read about in the book. Was that common? And do you have any experience sewing? Because it was very detailed the way you described how she went about maybe some of the ruching in certain dresses.
Sure.
And the lines of the fashion.
So I have to say I'm a knitter, not a sewer yet. There's a very, very poorly kept, and my family's watching right now, so they're going to laugh when they hear this, but there's a very poorly kept secret that there may be a sewing machine in my future, maybe for Christmas this year, which I have to say I would absolutely love. There is a history and a bit of a tradition of dressmaking in my family, and then quilting on my father's side. So on my mother's side, my grandmother was a dressmaker, and my mother knows how to cut patterns and sew and things like that. So it's always been something that I've been interested in. And I think when it comes to Lily's story, being able to make your own clothes, of course, is a lot more economical than having to have somebody make them, especially in this era where you would have had fewer items of clothing in your wardrobe. Fast fashion really isn't a thing. And so you would have spent maybe more money on good fabric and then actually gone through the effort of making the dress yourself, because it gives you a little bit more freedom. And for Lily, it's absolutely a budgetary consideration, but it's also a creative outlet and a way to sort of focus on some things other than the season and other than the sort of worries about what's potentially going on with her family and their various secrets that are not being told and things that are not being talked about in the background in her family.
In terms of writing style, this book is quite different from your last one, in the sense that you do refer to a past timeline on occasion, but you aren't navigating 3 separate timelines at once.
Yeah.
Did you find this easier to write? How did you enjoy this kind of different approach?
Yeah, I think as an author, one of the things that I'm always trying to do is challenge myself and do something different book to book. And it might sound funny to, say that a single point of view, one timeline, there's no moving back and forth across, flashback scenes or anything like that, is a challenge, but it's something I haven't done yet for historical fiction. And I really, really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed focusing on a single character and really sort of zooming in on what her story would be. And it is very different from The Last Garden in England. And it's very different from my previous 3 historical fictions, including that book, because it's not about World War II. It takes us out of that era and into a different world. And I think as an author, it's nice to kind of continually try to keep things fresh for yourself, because you live with these books, of course, for ages. You write them, it takes months, and then you go through the editing process and the proofreading process and all of that. And then sure enough, just as you're thinking about a new project and working on a new project, it's time to promote the book and to think about it and talk about it again. So it was really fun for me doing that. And I have to say, it was also pretty straightforward to write as well. I think not having the distraction of other things going on in my life because I was in lockdown during various times, while I wouldn't wish that again, was in some ways very helpful because I could really kind of get my head down and focus on the book. Ironically, for a book that's very much about society and a lot of socializing, I wasn't doing very much of that while I was writing it. So it was, I think, the right book for the right time.
So last time we were speaking, I believe was last February, you had told us just a little bit. You were giving us a glimpse of this book. Had you already begun writing, and how long did it take you to write The Last Dance of the Debutante?
I think, let me think. So that would have been February 20th. So I had written the first draft. This is me having to go back and do publishing now. It's always challenging. So I had written the first draft and I had handed it in. And I think I was just starting edits. So my editor had sent me a letter back saying, it's wonderful, it's great. Let's think about changing these things to make it better. And that's always a process I really enjoy. I like being edited. I think it comes from having been a journalist and having a lot of that newsroom feedback in my formative working years. But it was definitely not a finished product at that point in time.
Okay, good to know. In terms of the characters in your novel, which character did you enjoy writing the most and why?
Oh, it's hard to pick just one, but I have to say I do have a soft spot for Katherine. So Katherine Norman is kind of nicknamed the millionaire debutante because her father owns a publishing empire of newspapers in the U.S. and in Britain, and he and his American expat wife are very wealthy and very much not members of society, of sort of high society. They are still very new in their money. And even in this era, people, and even today, I think people do kind of, there's a difference between old money and new money to some people. And so they think that having a daughter who's a debutante will be their ticket to being accepted. And Lily, the main character, sort of knows, and Katherine, their daughter, knows that that's probably never going to be the case for them, but Katherine might benefit from that. But Katherine's actually got other ambitions for herself, as it sort of teases in the blurb. She really wants to go out and work. And so this is the deal that she's struck with herself, that she'll do this for her parents, and then she'll go off and she'll try to make her way in the world as a working woman. And that actually is parallel with what some of the debutantes from 1958 ended up doing. There are women who did a lot of different things coming out of this particular class of debutantes. And I think it's really interesting because some took very traditional routes, which would have been, marrying well. And in some cases, some of them are responsible for turning some of Britain's great houses into profitable great houses so that they could preserve them. Some ended up, becoming models for designers like Mary Quant and other, fashion designers in the 1960s. And some went on to university and followed a completely different path. So I think Katherine is an interesting, like Lily, sort of needing to make some decisions. Katherine's maybe a little further along in making those decisions, but she also sort of represents one of the areas that women were moving into during this time.
I enjoyed reading Catherine's character as well. Was she based on a real life character?
No, she wasn't. And I wish I could say she was, because I'd like to write that woman's book very much, but maybe I'll find somebody that sort of fits the mold eventually.
Just as in your previous novel, some readers may have difficulty bearing with some of the more over-the-top personalities you depict. So I'm speaking here maybe of Leana, maybe of Lily's mother, maybe of Lily's grandmother. So how did you go about balancing out the personalities and making sure each rung true?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I think in fiction you can play with heightening some elements. So I would say everybody in the book is based on there's some thread of reality there in terms of I've met people like Leana, I've met people like Lily's grandmother, I've met people like Lily's mother, and maybe you pull out little threads that kind of heighten that a little bit more than you would in sort of real life, because it's a narrative and you need to put it in order and have things make sense. But I think one of the things that I find really helpful is working on figuring out what everybody wants, which sounds really simple and straightforward, but what's everybody's motivation in the book and why? Why does Lily's grandmother really care so much so that she wants to bankroll Lily's season, which can be very expensive? Why does she care so much that Lily becomes a debutante? Why has her mother been essentially reclusive and hidden away from the world after her husband's death during the war? What does Lily herself want? And so I think so long as there's a grain of truth in there, and so long as these people are motivated by real desires that make sense, and they behave in a way that makes logical sense with those desires, which is the other key thing, I think, in any story, then I hope readers will go along with them. And, sometimes you're supposed to hate some people. Sometimes you're supposed to really love some characters. Sometimes you feel ambivalent about some characters. And I think that's a good thing. My hope is always that books make you sort of sit back, think a little bit, and that things stick with you for a while.
You definitely did that. In this book, you do once again tackle the theme of a woman's role in society. Can you tell us a bit more about the court presentations and doing this season, and what this ultimately meant for both the young women partaking in this practice as well as their families?
Sure. So the court presentations originally started as a way to sort of distinguish the upper classes of British society. And you would have to be invited. So you couldn't buy it, you couldn't apply for it. And you had to apply for and ask for an invitation and just hope for the best. So especially in 1958, you can imagine they announce it's the last season that they're doing this. And then the palace is just flooded with invitation requests. So what ends up happening is, this is a large pool of families that really are invested in having their daughters presented. It legitimizes sort of the upper echelons of society. But as Britain changes over the years, over a couple of centuries, you see more and more industrialists, solicitors, barristers, ambassadors, foreign dignitaries, all wanting their daughters to be presented because it has this kind of sheen of respectability and acceptance within this society that comes along with it. And so I think with that in mind, that's kind of really what the court presentation is supposed to do. It's almost like an endorsement of the fact that these women belong to a certain class, and then that goes into the season, which really originally was about making sure that these young women who essentially were in the schoolroom and were being brought out into society for the first time, where they were sort of supposed to be more socially visible, it basically means that they're out on the marriage market. And so this is again where you get sort of your Jane Austen moments of girls being at parties. And some of that was still true in the 1950s, but it maybe took on a slightly different look. So rather than necessarily saying, this girl is out on the market, it's more, we want you to meet a nice young man. We want you to meet, the brother of one of your fellow debutantes, or an officer who's invited from one of the regiments. And the idea was that you were supposed to make connections with people who would potentially be important in your lives. These would be the people who would be your friends, who would potentially be your romantic interest, and then maybe you would in fact get married. And that happened. The young men were nicknamed Deb's Delights. And some women actually did end up marrying the Deb's Delights that they met. Some Deb's Delights were Deb's Delights year after year after year. They just were perpetually single and would go, if you had a dinner jacket apparently, and you were moderately well connected, you could probably wrangle an invitation to one of these parties. So they were always looking for young men to dance with the girls and make conversation at dinner.
So you touched upon it just a little bit right there. I was going to say the issue of class is definitely an important one in this novel as well. And some might say it's partly why the presentations to court finally did go by the wayside. Can you talk a little bit more about this aspect? On the one hand, we are told, and this is the title, is that it's the last dance, and it's supposed to be kind of the last presentations, but the whole idea of the debutante in the seasons is not really over after 1958. So maybe I'll let you expand on that a little bit.
Well, I think maybe the best way to describe this is the indelicate story of Princess Margaret, apparently at a previous presentation party, looked around and said, they're letting every tart in London into these. And so, Margaret, in her always gracious way, sort of put the nail on the head, which is that I think Britain and society was starting to feel like it was moving on, and it wasn't what it once was. A lot of people talk about the last great season being 1939, which is, the season right before war broke out. So war breaks out September 3rd, 1939, and you have presentations starting from March. So you get through most of the season until really the girls are meant to be going up to Scotland for the Scottish balls. Although, of course, people are hearing the rumblings in Europe that there might be war. So I think it's sort of one of those things where the debutante, the want to present debutantes, as my friends, who came out in 1964 were saying, it was still happening, but I think it was becoming more and more difficult as there were other options for girls to draw girls into the season, and certain things that were a really big deal. So for instance, if you YouTube Queen Charlotte's ball and look for some of the black and white footage, it's fascinating. It's all these girls in white dresses. They all curtsy to a cake that's supposed to represent Queen Charlotte, who is the first queen who really did presentations for her birthday. It's very odd, but it was this fixture of society. And it ends at the end of the 1960s, sort of early 1970s. It just doesn't happen anymore. And they've tried to revive it in London, but it's not what it was. It's a very different feeling to it than I think it was, because you don't have the buy-in from society any longer. And society really fractures. There's just so many other things that girls can be doing. And I think it's a bit of the changing of times.
Can you tell us a little bit about Lily's ambitions and how they sort of come to the forefront as the novel progresses?
Yeah, so I'm particularly interested in young women and young women at various transitional points in history. So when, as I said before, you have more options, you have more choices in terms of what your life can potentially look like. And so in Lily's case, she is good at school. She's interested in school. She sort of has a teacher who has encouraged her in the past to take on potentially doing an entrance exam for university. And in her case, she's particularly interested in Cambridge. And I think for her, it's sort of something that she would really like to do. And then the season really comes and just puts a stop to that, because it was a full-time job for these girls. I know it sounds a bit mad saying, it's a full-time job to go to parties and events and things like that, but it was grueling. It was exhausting. You could be at a party, starting at 6 o'clock if you went to a dinner party before a ball, and you could, be going home at 4 a.m. And then obviously you would have to sleep and do it all over again. And so I think for a lot of these girls, and I spoke to a couple of people who said, I had wanted to go to university, but I did the season instead. And I never ended up actually going because that was sort of my opportunity. I think for a lot of these girls, it's a real question of what they ultimately want. With their life. And so for her, she sort of needs to go through some stages of maybe growing up and also deciding what it is that she wants her life to look like. I've always enjoyed reading a coming of age story. And in some ways, this is a coming of age story. She's just also coming out into society as a debutante at the same time that she's going through her coming of age.
It's a beautiful coming of age story. Some of what I appreciated in this book is also the friendships that Lily develops, and the fact that at the beginning, it does change a little bit, but she's definitely open to all sorts of different personalities, befriending people from different classes. And Leana is not quite the same.
No, and Liana's a funny one. I've known people like Liana who they're glamorous and they're exciting, and if you're in the circle, they can be wonderful until you're not quite in the circle, or until you're not quite willing to play the same game that they're wanting to play, and you're not willing to sort of fall in lockstep with them. And I think Liana is one of those, without giving too much away, one of those characters who I think is in a way a very sad character, and a very difficult person, but also her life could have gone a very different way, if that makes sense, without letting too much else out. And so yeah, I think when you talk about sort of Lily being open to meeting a lot of different people, when we first meet her, she's lived a relatively sheltered life outside of being able to go to school, and that's where she does have relationships with other girls. But her mother is very reclusive, and so a lot of the sort of, you would invite your daughter to, they would invite your daughter to their house, you would invite their daughter to your house, that kind of exchange, her mother just isn't interested or isn't really capable of doing anymore. And so it does mean that she sort of is pushed out into this world where now, really, to make it, she needs friends, she needs to survive the season, she needs to enjoy it as much as she can. And so I think she's really game and really up for just seeing what the world is like. She's a little unshaped, I think, when we first meet her, and then she kind of realizes who she wants to be.
Another important theme in this novel, I would say, is expectations, living up to people's expectations and kind of determining whether you can follow that path while staying true to yourself. You want to talk about this a little bit more?
Yeah, I think it's something that most people go through at some point in their lives. Whether you want to, and this happens in different ways in different people's lives, obviously, but whether you are going to sort of stay on the path that somebody else has decided is right for you, or whether you're going to sort of go off on your own, which probably has a lot more risk and is a lot scarier in some ways, but also can be a lot truer to who you are. And so I think, again, this is where the coming of age story really comes into play. This is the first time that Lily is making those choices, and the first time that she's really able to make those choices because she's old enough to, and because her world starts to open up, and she becomes more and more exposed to different people with different ideas. And so they may have a different set of expectations or no expectations for how they expect she'll behave. And for her, I think that's very liberating.
I did find it very interesting. You spoke about it a little bit earlier, but this sort of the gauche kind of nature of how people were looking at Katherine and Katherine's family, because it was sort of the nouveau riche, and there was a lot of snobbery around Katherine's family. So I did appreciate how you depicted that. I thought it was quite interesting because there are just so many intersecting different ideas about class, whether it's who's presenting the young lady to court. I also felt the snickering if it was not the mother who presented the young lady.
Yeah, and it's funny. I mean, don't get me wrong. These are all very privileged people, and I will be the most upfront about that. I don't think that makes what Katherine or Lily is feeling any less valid, but I think it's important to acknowledge that these are people who either were presented or have the money to pay for a chaperone who has herself been presented, so that they can have that legitimacy. And to even get an invitation, you would have had to be vetted by the palace, essentially. So, it's shades of class within the upper echelons of British society. But I think that in and of itself is interesting, because it's not so straightforward as just, this is an upper class person who has the connections. There's also a level of who has what gowns, who has what connections, who's invited to what parties, who knows already, the movers and shakers within society who can kind of help set a girl up. And so I was interested in, because I think class is fascinating and interesting to explore in general, but I was particularly interested for this book in looking at sort of a little bit of a narrower focus on, again, the upper classes of British society, and what that differentiation would mean when they're all sort of lumped into this group together.
So I believe I've heard you either discuss or read somewhere about your own experiences with a certain maybe pageant in Pasadena. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so first of all, I do have a tiara here, but this was purchased on Amazon not very long ago. So here, for this portion, I will wear my tiara. I am from Pasadena in California, in Los Angeles, and we are famous for having the New Year's Day Rose Parade, which is broadcast, I think, still very, very widely. And one of the big things in the Rose Parade is the Queen and her court. So they have their own float and they wave, and they do a lot of events and open up various things. It's a bit of a beauty pageant, a bit of a society thing, and every girl I knew in Southern California went, and you go and you audition for it. Essentially, this is going to fall off, so I'll take this off for a moment. But essentially what you do is you go to the Tournament of Roses house, and you line up and you go through the whole process, and they talk to you, they have you hold a bouquet of roses, they take your photograph. They're kind of figuring out who they want the court to be. And I think there's one queen and several princesses. And we were very excited because the year before, a girl from my school had been named the Rose Queen. And so I went and I did it because everybody does. And I really enjoyed it. And I think I made it to the next round. My sister, who's 2 years younger than me, made it to the semifinals, I think. And she claims that she didn't get it because they asked if they could cut her hair. And she said, absolutely not. But the funny thing about this is it's so universal that I was standing in a queue to get into a view at college with some visiting friends in Oxford. And I was describing this to them because I think I was thinking about the potential of writing this book. And somebody behind me went, "You must be from Pasadena." I did that too. And this was a woman I'd never seen before in my life. And so it just, it's one of those strange universal experiences. So while I was not a debutante, that was kind of my little brush with a debutante-like activity when I was growing up.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It was a great anecdote. I do see we have a question coming in. I was about to say, let's see if the audience has any questions. And I think someone read my mind because a question immediately popped up. So the question is, thank you for a very fascinating presentation. As the subject matter is very similar to Bridgerton, what do you make of the TV series' purposeful intent of including a multiracial cast? Were the debutante seasons multiracial? And if not, after your research into the upper echelons of society, what is your take on the TV series revisionism?
Sure. So I think I really enjoyed the show. I have read some of the books, not all of them. I like the approach that they've taken. I think, the reality is, I used to be a romance author, and before I was writing historical fiction. And I think it's also something that historical fiction has a problem with also, which is not necessarily representing all of the voices and all of the people that were active during a particular time period. It's not as though we only start seeing people in the United States of color or people in Britain when it becomes historically significant because there's an event we're talking about that features people of color. And so, I think for me, I felt like it was a really wonderful addition to the show. I felt like the right actors were cast, and that was the most important thing to me. I think the Duke of Hastings is really handsome, and I was very happy, and I enjoyed seeing him in the first season, and I'm looking forward to the second season. I think when it comes to, I'm just double checking the rest of, were the debutantes multiracial as well? I can see the questions too. There were some, so it was universally white, but there were some debutantes who were presented who were of different races. And in fact, I've seen some photographs, and I have to figure out when they were. I was doing some research for a TikTok video. The Burmese ambassador brought out 2 or 3 girls. He and his wife brought them out during the 1958 season as well. And they were actually photographed as, I'm sure, part of a press photography thing for the Times, which has published and still publishes the court circular. So that's sort of where and what various significant people in society are doing, as well as the royals themselves. So it was really interesting seeing that as an element to the presentations as well. Although again, I won't lie to you, it was not a particularly diverse, multiracial event. It was very predominantly white, but it is interesting seeing different ways that maybe people wouldn't expect people of different backgrounds to show up during that time.
Thank you, Julia. So I will invite the audience to type in their questions if they have any in the Q&A or the chat. In the meantime, as promised, Julia, I will ask you how your garden is doing that we discussed a little bit last time.
I have a garden, and I know so the last time we discussed, or last time we talked about the last garden in England, I told you I didn't have a garden while writing the book, but I had literally just moved when we spoke, and my flat has a garden. So it's going really well. It's still very much a work in progress. I suspect it probably always will be a work in progress, but I just had a fence installed, which meant ripping a whole bunch of stuff out in order to do that. But I have a pond, I have dahlias, I have roses. I'm really, really happy. So I've been living my best garden life this year, and I'm very, very happy about it.
Great, we're glad to hear it. The other thing I was going to ask you about, because I remember last time we spoke, being a little taken aback on your crazy schedule. You were getting up so early, you were running, you were cooking.
Are you in lockdown?
Yes. Are you still maintaining this very quick, fast-paced rhythm of life?
Well, I will say things have changed a bit, partially because I have quit my day job, which is very exciting. So I'm now writing full time, which is wonderful. Unfortunately, I am still running, and I am still cooking and all of those things, but maybe on a little bit less hectic schedule. But everybody's okay, everybody's fine. But I did get COVID about 2 weeks after running a half marathon, which is only to say that I haven't been running really since then. But I'm fully recovered, and everybody seemed to be okay. So nobody else I was close to outside of my partner and myself ended up with any of the illness. So we're doing well. And I think both of us just hoping to quietly make it to Christmas and without too much stress. That's the most recent goal.
Yes, well, we're sorry to hear that you went through that, but very happy to hear that you're recovering now.
It was the best case scenario.
Okay, so there is another question from the audience. What advice would you give to someone who would like to pursue a full-time career in writing?
It's a really, really big question. And I feel like I could almost take an hour talking about that in and of itself. But, it's interesting having just done this transition about 6 months ago to writing full time. I think the big thing for me was just, I wrote for as long as I felt like, I wrote and I worked my day job for as long as I felt like it was really viable, because it helped with security. It helped me take some pressure off of the books that I was writing to earn a certain amount of money, to make sure that I could, have a living, all of those things. So I think figuring out a way to find enough balance where you can write, but still support yourself and understand that, being an author is a business. It's a creative business and it's wonderful and I love it, but it still does need to pay the bills if that's what you want to do full time. I think it really, it was helpful kind of approaching it from that direction. Now, when I was ready around the last garden in England, when I was really ready to make the jump, I was ready. I was very, I was very ready. So I think you also then need to know when the right time for you is in terms of transitioning from writing with a day job and then writing full time. But I'm very glad I made the change. Very glad I made the jump, and I also have a really good strong community of people around me who are very supportive, because it's a very scary thing to do. Even though there's happy outcomes and it's wonderful, it's a big change. So
Yeah, that's great to hear. We're very happy for you. I know we have some other questions. Just a moment. Hi, Julia. Thank you for such a great discussion about your new book. I can't wait to read it. I'm curious to know if you're working on anything new and what we can look forward to reading next from you. Also, any recommendations of what you are reading now?
So what I'm reading now is easier than what, what I'm working on next. So I'll do that. I literally just finished Christy Woodson Harvey's The Wedding Veil. So that was wonderful. And that comes out, I think, in March of next year. And I am currently reading The Postmistress of Paris by Meg Waits Clayton, which I think came out in November of this year. So I'm sort of doing a bit of catch up and a bit of reading ahead also, which is always fun. In terms of what I'm working on right now, I always feel so bad about saying this because I don't know what the title is, because we haven't figured that out yet. It's the hardest part, genuinely. It's the hardest part of figuring out how to launch a book with a publisher, is everybody agreeing on a title, because I'm not very good at them. So I'm calling it Remember Me, My Love. It may very well change, but I'm also calling it the Liverpool book, because it's a book set in Liverpool. And the quick version of it is there's a young woman, a young Catholic woman, who is falls pregnant to a young man who's Jewish, so from a different faith, and their families get together and decide these two need to marry in order to legitimize the child that they're going to have. And so they go to the registry office, they're married, and then her family turns around and tells him to leave because they have essentially bought him off. He's a struggling musician with big ambitious dreams of going to New York, and they essentially say, take this money, go, but the condition is that you never come back and you don't know your daughter or son that you're going to have. And so that's sort of the opening of the book. And the book then follows these two characters at two very different points in their lives who are still separate. And on her side, she has to evacuate her daughter in World War II, and also figure out how to change her own life, which has been very dominated by the fact that she's a young mother with an estranged husband. And he is this struggling musician who's trying to figure out what he really wants in his life and why he's unhappy, even though he's gotten the thing that he wants, which is to have a music career. So he actually enrolls or enlists himself rather back in England in the RAF. And so it's the two of them sort of as two opposing forces until they then converge for one very significant reason that I don't want to spoil. But it's sort of how these two sort of people who broke apart then come back together again.
Sounds very promising and intriguing. So I'm sure we'll all be reading your next project as well.
Thank you.
You said earlier, here's another question. You said earlier you were a writer of romance novels. Can you comment and amplify on your transition to historical and other fiction?
Sure, yeah. So I was a romance novelist, mostly historical romance, mostly in the Victorian era, sort of writing about London and also writing about Edinburgh, which is another city close to my heart. And I absolutely loved writing romance. I thought it was a lot of fun. I really, really enjoyed the community and the community of readers. And I also realized that as much as I loved romance, there were also some stories that were not specifically about a single romantic couple or that didn't end happily ever after, which are the two, defining characteristics of a romance novel. So there were other stories that I wanted to tell, and that those stories became, first of all, The Light Over London. And so my books typically will have a romantic thread through them. But the romance now really isn't necessarily the focus of the story. The focus of the story is really usually about a young woman's transition to a different point in her life. So whether that's a coming of age story or sort of coming into who she is at a different point in her life, that's typically what I'm writing right now. So, leaving romance wasn't anything other than feeling like there were some stories that I wanted to tell that were wonderful in their own rights. And I really, really have enjoyed watching the romance community grow from the sidelines over in historical fiction. And I've been enjoying also sort of expanding and trying new things and trying my hand at some new challenges in historical fiction. So I feel like I got the best of both worlds.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. Something else just did pop up in the chat. This new book sounds incredible. I visited Liverpool a few years ago. We did a Beatles trip. I'm looking forward to reading The Wedding Veil, and I have The Postmistress of Paris from the library right now. So this person tuning in says that you two have similar tastes.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I'm so glad to hear. So glad to hear they went to Liverpool. It's a city very close to my heart because it's where my mother is from and where her family is from. And I've always wanted to write a book set in that city because I think it's a really, really wonderful, really interesting place. And of course, a lot of people know it for the Beatles, but it had a really important and very significant role during World War II, which is it was a huge port, and it also had a lot of manufacturing, and so it was a target of a lot of airstrikes and a lot of bombing during World War II, and really it devastated the city. It actually, my family doesn't have many, if any, photographs from before the war because the house was bombed, and so nothing survived from that house. Fortunately, everybody was okay, but it's just a really, really fascinating thing to look at cities outside of London that may be a little bit less familiar to some readers, and sort of hopefully give a bit of a flavor of what life was like during that time in those places.
When do you think we can expect to read this book?
My hope is winter 2022, winter 2023. So I'm sort of on a book a year schedule with these books, which is really, really nice. It means that I get to come and talk to people a couple of times, every year. And it's been really lovely and it suits me very well. So hopefully I'll be able to continue doing that.
It sounds perfect. So for everyone who tuned in, I'll just remind you to put your name down for The Last Dance of the Debutante, which is coming very soon to our library. You can also purchase a copy online at Paragraph Bookstore. If you want more information about that, feel free to contact the librarian and they will direct you. Thank you so much, Julia, for taking the time to speak with me again. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you.
And we're excited to see what you do next.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.